Well, welcome to week 4 of the class. It's hard to believe that we're just about at the halfway point, but here we are. That is summer school. I want to introduce this week by reflecting on something that you did previously in the class, and then I want to just very briefly summarize some of the key points in the notes that you're going to be reading through this week, as well as just talk a little bit about what the two assignments are this week. And then encourage you to review some additional materials that will be available to you. So first of all, I wanted to look back on the class a little bit. This week, you're going to be investigating some information as well as some examples and procedures, and in this case, a product or a project. And its focus is on positivist research, or sometimes referred to as quantitative research. And that's what this week is going to focus on. And I just want to say that a couple weeks back you were asked to search for and identify a misconception about teaching and learning that you might have held at some point in your past. And then you do a literature search or research, and you identify some support that it is in fact a misconception and that something else might be true. And some of the misconceptions that were brought up, I had been part of this class, but some weren't. And one teacher brought up learning that a letter a week, like in primary grade, teaching a letter a week was a good and maybe the best way to organize instructional experiences. Maybe just sort of taken for granted that was really the best way to do it. And it turns out there's some good research out there to indicate that may not be the case. And it made me think a lot about, well, what would be a better way to do it then? Should letters be taught sort of in conjunction with other letters, other common blends or common words in which all the letters are identified and learned together? I'm not sure, but maybe it definitely made me think about that. The learning styles was something that many students in this class identified as a misconception that they had sort of had in their framework of teaching, particularly as it applies to differentiated instruction. And it may be that it's a misconception because it's something that is actually perpetuated in some professional development experiences, and perhaps even in a class in your program at Radford or a program at another college or university. And one thing I wanted to say about that is that what the research shows about learning styles, I think is a little bit misleading to say learning styles don't exist. I think if you have 10 people in the room, I think you have 10 unique learning styles. It's 10 unique people. Really, what is being concluded in the research is that there isn't one better type of instruction over another, if what needs to be learned requires the best possible instructional strategy for that thing to be learned. So it's really about the fact that you don't have to do 4 different types of instruction to help a room full of learners who all have their own style learn. You have to do the part of the instruction or you have to do the instruction aligning with the strategies that are most appropriate for that instruction. And then if you have students in the class who are struggling because they have a preference or over, verbal, auditory, kinesthetic, whatever, if that's something that represents a support for them, then you can respond as a teacher. If you identify learners who are struggling, then that's when differentiation comes in. And it's not doing different lessons, it's addressing the individual needs of each student in the class, and that is what a good teacher does anyway. So another misconception that came up was the idea that if you just surround students with a lot of resources in a classroom, a lot of books, that kind of by diffusion, students will learn how to read, and that's certainly definitely a false assumption. And another interesting thing, which I thought this was interesting, somebody said, they said, my misconception was that I thought problem-based or project-based learning was the most effective approach to instruction for all students. And it turns out there's some good research out there that suggests for younger kids, maybe primary grade and maybe even in early childhood, that might not always be the best approach, is project-based learning. So I thought those are very interesting. And the bottom line, though, is how do we know that those are misconceptions and that something else might be true, is through research. And in most of those cases, it's primarily through positivist research, because dispelling misconceptions is about identifying causes of things, and that is something that is best served through positivist research models. So that's a little bit about misconceptions. I want to summarize briefly the notes, and that is that the notes for this week, for week 4, focus on the different types of positivist research approaches or models of research. And so you're going to be learning a little bit more about what are categorized as 4 fundamental types of positivist research. And the first one is non-experimental research. Then there's pre-experimental research, and then there's experimental, and then there's quasi-experimental. And you're going to learn a little bit about what makes each of those a different category of quantitative research, and you're going to learn a little bit about the types of studies that are typically done within those categories. So that's the focus of the notes for this week. You do have an assignment in terms of reading from the course book. And the reason why you're going to read this is not only is that it's fascinating 3 chapters in part 3 of this book, but also because you're going to apply what is presented in that part of the book to the very first reflection assignment. And so one thing about the 3 chapters you're going to read is that they focus on kind of applying learning theory to research-supported practices that lead to effective learning by students. And the 3 areas that are the focus, one per chapter, are there is the planning for learning, how learners can best plan their experience through an instructional endeavor. There is strategies for developing understanding, which of course is interesting because understanding needs to be operationalized first. And so that's all part of what goes into that chapter. And then there's then chapter 10, the final one from part 3, is about retrieval practices, having information, concepts, ideas structured and organized in the head, and how can those be consciously brought forward by learners and applied within different situations. So that is those are the focus of those readings. And as educators, I think you'll find them very fascinating. It may seem like a lot of reading, but once again, hopefully you found that with the book, it's a lot of graphics to support the ideas that are being presented, the constructs, and so it seems like a lot of reading, but it's not. And as I mentioned, it's going to be applied in the first reflection. And in the first reflection, I just want to say something about that. You're going to watch a TED Talk for that reflection, written or presented by the man who wrote this book, and he'll reference it, and I'll also reference it on the page. But this book, Moonwalking with Einstein, has been one of the most fascinating books I've read by far in the last 10 years. I won't say too much about it because the author introduces it really well, but it in the story, the real story, this is a man who's a writer. He's a sports writer, and he was at a hotel covering some sporting event. And somewhere in this kind of conference-like hotel, there was this thing called the International Memory Championship going on, and he went into a room or a hall area where the competition was going on, and he watched these people who were one of the things in the competition was they were given a deck of cards. And they were given a very, very short amount of time to go through the deck of cards and memorize the order of the cards as much as they could in just a couple of minutes' time, or something like that. And then he watched as they went through and named off the cards as the judges looked through the stack. And he was fascinated that there were people who got through the entire deck after having only spent a few minutes studying it. And so he went to interview one of the people, I think one of the people who won, and he learned that they used a trick, a memory trick. And it's a memory trick that goes back actually millennia. It's a trick that was used by people whose job it was to memorize these epic poems. By epic, I mean 600 pages of a poem like the Odyssey, and then be able to recite it back verbatim, right? And so it's a fascinating story. And so you're going to be applying the information from the reading in this book to the TED Talk that's presented online. So I think it's a really interesting one. And it's related to what you've been learning about in the book, because memory is a fundamental part of learning. And the author mentions that near the end of the video, and that's what you're going to be reflecting on. And then the project for this week relates directly to quantitative research model, because you're going to identify a research article that was lauded by Edutopia, which is an online professional development site for educators. It's created by the George Lucas Education Foundation, and every year for the last few years they've published what they consider to be their top 10 research topics that have had the biggest influence in the field of education, or maybe should have the biggest influence. And so you're going to review those top 10 topics from last year, the 2025, and you're going to identify one that just resonates with you, one that you would like to learn more about. And you will then go and read about that topic and identify one of the articles that are referenced. In some cases, only one article is referenced, and in some cases, multiple ones. And you'll go to that article, and they're all posted, and then you can read through it, and then you're going to analyze it based on the notes that are presented about quantitative research, positivist research for week 4 of the class. So you're going to really dive deep on trying to identify the different pieces of the research that was conducted. So that's it. I think those 2 projects are very interesting, or I should say those 2 assignments. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about anything, just let me know. And I'll be reviewing and grading the group projects that have been submitted as soon as I can. Hopefully we worked out a little bit of the bugs, and know that there is one more group project that will be presented, or you'll experience at the very end of the class. And so you'll be revisiting that idea. And I hope it wasn't too painful for those of you who don't prefer group work. Guilty as charged, Your Honor. Oh, and one more thing. I have a video beneath this video that presents something that I did for a class last year, and it's just I tell a story about the first time that I ever got involved in designing and conducting a quantitative research study. And I did it when I was in your position, when I was a graduate student. in one of in my program. So I hope I'm just presenting it because you might find it interesting that that somebody would like who's a novice researcher at the time would go about trying to investigate a question or a problem that I had as a teacher, and conducted a very simple study. And you'll look at the different variables, anyway, I just thought you might be interested in that story. So that's presented below.